Welcome to the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center. Art has been happening right here on this site since 1920. That was the first year of classes at the Broadmoor Art Academy, the Fine Arts Center's predecessor, and we've had over the duration since then a distinguished history of arts education, museum exhibitions, and a broad spectrum of performing arts. If it's art in whatever sort you can imagine, there's a pretty good chance it's happened right here. One of the big ideas with the opening of this building in 1936 was that no matter where you are in the building, you're going to experience art. So there are murals throughout your experience here. There are murals down in the cafe, were painted just after the building opened in 1936. There's a mural in the courtyard by Frank Machaut. There's a mural down in the new part of the building by classic artist, Colorado Springs favorite Eric Bransby. And as inspiration and as motivation for our expansion, right here in the lobby is a magnificent Chihuly chandelier. And so, reiterating, everywhere you go, there's going to be art, so keep your eyes open. This is one of our most important pieces because number one, Walt Kuhn, an early 20th century modern artist, which means he was on the cutting edge of art in America at that time when things were changing rapidly. Things were changing with society, things were changing with art, and he was right in there. In fact, he was a real mover and shaker in terms of bringing those exciting European innovations in art to America and introducing them to America for one of the first times at the 1913 Armory Show, for which he was one of the founders. So your question to me is, what then about this piece is modern?
Right.
Yeah. So what's modern about this piece is the way Walt Kuhn painted it. And he was an artist who was at that transition. He was keeping in mind and keeping in his artistic practice some very traditional kinds of ways of representation, ways of representing the world, right? He knew that we wanted to see things, by and large, in America still, in ways that we recognized, right? And yet he's giving us some moments, even in this painting, in which he's taking from some of those European modern precedents and adopting them as his own. Notice the general flatness of this painting, right? I think it was Museum of Modern Art curator Kurt Varnadoe who described the era of modern art as the road to flatness. And there's a lot of truth to that, right? Because what happened? Artists in that period, during the Industrial Revolution, were starting to recognize, right, I'm translating the 3- and 4-dimensional world onto a 2-dimensional surface. That's artifice, right? That's an artificial practice. And so why not acknowledge the flatness of that surface? Why not acknowledge what paint is, right? It's this sticky, pigmented substance that we're spreading around a 2-dimensional surface. And there's excitement in that. There's something new in that. And so as you look at this painting, you see this general flatness in the figures. You see a flatness in the background. Yeah, we can look at that background and think, well, that's probably a curtain. But we come to a point in which it might not even matter, right? It becomes a color, right? And a color evokes a feeling. And he's also using that color very wisely. Notice how that green of the background contrasts with that very warm, hot pink of the costumes there. Notice in the center figure what happens in those spaces in between that figure and the two to either side. You become very aware of those interstitial spaces between the figures, and in that become more aware of the overall composition and the balance of this. Notice how their faces are painted pretty realistically. They're painted as we might expect. He wants us to see the differentiation in their expressions and the difference in their facial features, but he's doing something even in the faces here that he probably learned as a young artist you don't do. There are outlines around particular features in the faces. Look at the outlines around the ears. Look at the outlines around the lips on these figures. You know, you learn as a young artist, you don't paint outlines around things because there are no outlines around things in the real world. And yet he's showing us that even these features are shapes just as much as anything else. And in their shapes, they're interesting to look at. So look all over the painting and notice how he's really defined particular shapes, all the way from the overall figures to the way the figures transition from that background down to the floor. Notice the outlines around the feet. And he's keeping us moving back and forth with this combination of recognizable form and ways of representing that, and very flat areas of shape and color. The gallery that we're standing in here is early to mid 20th century modern art. And this is a time in which things were changing dramatically. Art was really becoming a talking point internationally. The world wars helped do that, and they helped, especially in America, for us to turn our attention to those kinds of art in which we started to become really aware of how we defined ourselves as individuals, right? Because the artists, and not just visual artists, writers, musicians, playwrights, were all out there doing these things that frankly we saw elsewhere in the world the lack of possibility for that kind of expression. And so Arthur Dove was right at the forefront of that kind of expression here in America. And while by and large previous to artists like Arthur Dove, Walt Kuhn, Georgia O'Keeffe, art in America defined itself via subject matter. Now it could start to define itself via the subject matter and the style. So with modern art, and we talk about this notion of road to flatness, and we can certainly see that with this painting. There's an absolute acknowledgement of the two-dimensionality of this surface. But what he's trying to do here is not get a depiction of an event out there in front of us. The painting is titled Foghorns, but we don't see the apparatus of the foghorns. We see the effect of the foghorns. And that was something new, right? And it was inextricably intertwined with scientific investigations and discoveries that were going on in terms of sound and what sound actually does with color and what color actually does, especially with particular combinations of color. And so he's giving us that beautiful sort of dynamic synthesis of color, shape, the suggestion, and that's a big one, the suggestion of something outside what you see in the painting, right? So what we're seeing is essentially the sound that the foghorns make through color and through shape. So the concentric circles, what do they suggest? Maybe they suggest the progression of that sound across space, which gets pretty interesting given the flatness of the painting. But that's where our mind goes. So he also gives us his choice of color, right? It's very muted, very soft, right? But does evoke an emotional effect. It's kind of calming in a way, right? Which maybe goes back to the foghorns a little bit. We know those foghorns are out there somewhere telling us, whoa, wait a minute, we don't want to get any closer to the shore than perhaps we are right now. And the color also suggests atmosphere in a way. It's foggy, right? This is a seaside kind of image. It's a nautical kind of scene in a way. Not like the nautical scenes we had seen before this. And so it does all of these things as well as gives us a very balanced and beautiful composition. So what a museum like this wants is that when we bring a work of art into the collection, like Arthur Dove's foghorns. What we want is for a work that artist made at that game-changing point in their career, right? And although that's sort of a holy grail for any institution. I mean, you want that Picasso that happened right in those critical years in the teens, during the development of Cubism. For Arthur Dove, this was right there. This painting is a game changer. There's not another one like it out there in the world from Arthur Dove. George O'Keeffe was also right in there with the development of modern art in America. And with her, as with other artists that we'll see throughout the collection here and that we'll see throughout the Eloquent Objects exhibition that we'll have in the summer of 2015, these artists, alongside Georgia O'Keeffe, were developing this notion of abstraction and modern depictions of American subjects, specifically in the Southwest, right? In an area where artists had come, particularly from the East, to live temporarily or to settle and to adopt those very unique Southwestern subjects and motifs and ideas into their art as something that was uniquely American. Irises were a favorite subject for O'Keeffe. She had a beautiful iris garden outside her house in Abiquiu. And one thing I love about this painting, and one thing to really look closely at, is that from a distance, absolutely, we see an iris as we're familiar with that beautiful flower. But when you look at particular aspects of this painting, and I would encourage you to put your hand right in front of your face and cover up particular portions of it. And notice how everything remaining doesn't necessarily speak to you of iris or even a flower. It becomes almost purely abstract. And so she's clearly, as she develops this composition, looking at each of those little areas as they speak individually, as beautiful shapes and colors and the suggestion of form, and then how they all come together as a whole to suggest an iris. Take note of the scale of this painting and the large scale in particular of it. You know, this isn't the small, intimate, little abstract painting that we often see now. This is a large-scale painting done at a time in America when abstraction was the defining element of American art. And this notion of creating a large painting in which, from even a distance, you're immersed in that painting, in which you sometimes even lose the edges of the painting out of your peripheral vision and become part of the painting, was a big and important idea when Diebenkorn made this in the 1950s. So you want to view it from a distance, which you do upon approaching the room, but then you want to come within a reasonable distance of the painting. Always be sure to stay about arm's length away from the work, but I think even at that length, you can get a really great sense of that time in which Diebenkorn was painting this work. And imagine him right up in that canvas, painting these shapes and colors and being completely immersed in this surface and what it was doing, how it was pushing and pulling on him emotionally. It's been suggested that this is an aerial view of Urbana. This was when he was working at the university there. And whether or not it's an aerial view, we don't quite know. We do know that Diebenkorn, more often than not, based his, what we would call pure abstractions, on the observed world. Right? So they're not just coming completely out of his head. It's not completely and pure expression. It's based on something observed. And so we start to think about what individual components might be here. And we start to try and recognize pieces and parts of it. And at a certain point, we have to decide whether or not we can, and then subsequently whether or not that's actually important to our experience of the painting, or did he really want to draw our attention to these magnificent combinations and relationships between particular shapes, lines, colors, the layering of paint in particular areas. What color is underneath another color? How did he build up this surface? Where are the areas of thickly painted canvas and where are the areas in which it's thinner? An interesting thing about the color in this painting is that he wasn't in Urbana long. He had gone there to teach at the university from New Mexico, where he'd gone to college there. His paintings in New Mexico, although many of a similar scale to this, were of those colors that we understand as being particular to that region of the world, the Southwest. There were a lot of browns and whites and black lines. And by the time he gets to Urbana, he starts working with a much more boldly hued palette. And this is a transitional period. Diebenkorn's best known work happened once he went from Urbana out to California and started painting with those colors in that palette that we might more readily associate with the West Coast, right? Especially California, those beautiful blues and whites and very bright colored paintings.